This is my Assyrian miniature army. The figures are plastic, scaled at 1/76 and made by Caesar and Hat. Not blowing my own trumpet, but this is a very formidable force. The Assyrians were one of the first truly disciplined, well-organised armies in history. They have a certain uniformity in dress and colour, which increases cohesion, very important in ancient warfare. They have these very distinctive conical helmets. It's a very well-balanced army too. There are good combinations of different types of troops, which allows great flexibility in operations. The core of the army is massed heavy infantry, armoured men on foot, armed with spears and very large shields. Then there are plenty of more lightly equipped missile troops, armed with bows and slings. There is also some heavy cavalry, something we associate with ancient armies, but actually a relatively new innovation. It took time for breeding programs to produce horses large enough and strong enough to be able to carry a fully armed, fully armoured warrior. Early armies used chariots instead. Speaking of which, here at the back are very heavy 4-man, 4-horse chariots, far removed from the light skirmishing 2-man, 2-horse versions traditionally used by people like the Egyptians, for example. These are shock troops, but designed to charge through resistance, a kind of main battle tank of the ancient world. The Assyrians had been around for a very long time. They were grouped around several cities within a rather less fashionable part of the Fertile Crescent, the great swathe of particularly productive land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Their fortunes had waxed and waned over the centuries, but at the tail end of the 10th century BC they came back with a vengeance. Historians call this reinvigorated Assyrian state the Neo or New Assyrian Empire. Over the next 3 centuries they steadily grew to dominate the whole of the Middle East. There were 3 reasons for their success. Firstly, the collapse of the old Hittite and Mitanni empires to the west created a power vacuum that they were simply able to move into, providing a very good base for further expansion. Secondly, they were blessed with a long line of unusually strong and effective kings, starting with a man called Ashurnazirpal, and then going on to better-known figures like Tiglath-Pileser, mentioned in passing in the Bible, and then moving on to people like Shalmaneser, Sargon, and Sennacherib. The third reason for the success of the Assyrians was military innovation. I've already mentioned the heavy assault chariots, but the real advances were in planning and organisation. The Assyrians instituted the world's first standing army, disciplined, organised and yet flexible. They were particularly adept at siege warfare, a necessary condition for imperial armies at a time when fortifications were very difficult to pierce. Living in such a rich, fertile country meant a food surplus and wealth, which in turn led to a population increase and the creation of a leisure class. It also attracted the envious attention of those from less fortunate lands. Of necessity, the Assyrians had to defend themselves from people trying to steal from them. Unfortunately, the very characteristics that made their land so productive also made it difficult to defend. It was flat, few obstacles, easy to traverse quickly, and because the land was so productive, an attacking army could easily live off of it. To get round this, the Assyrians developed what is known to the military today as a forward defensive strategy, which is a polite euphemism for hit them before they hit you. In other words, before potential enemies could attack them, the Assyrians would strike first. They were able to do this because of their superior organisation and administration. The standing army was supplemented by strategically placed storehouses full of supplies and weapons that enabled the army to be mobilised and deployed very quickly, before their opponents were ready to move. Preemptively attacking has a lot of advantages. Mundanely, it means the battles are fought in enemy territory and not over your own fields and holdings. The enemy's farms are the ones that are getting burnt, and it is their crops being spoilt, not yours. Militarily, it's usually easier to defend than attack, but attacking does have some advantages. Attackers have the initiative. They choose where and when the battles will be fought. If they move fast enough, and the Assyrians could move very quickly, they might even be able to achieve surprise, and the element of surprise is easily the most important factor in successful military operations. This forward defensive strategy protected the Assyrian heartland well enough, but paradoxically, it turned out to be too successful. Contrary to what pacifists would have you believe, war, certainly at this time anyway, could be very profitable, assuming of course that you won, and the new highly efficient Assyrian military machine usually did win. A victorious campaign brought in huge amounts of loot, so much so that the rewards of war soon came to easily outstrip the profits that could be made from more mundane and traditional profit-making activities, like trade or farming. We can see the success of this strategy from excavations at Nineveh. Even given that the city was eventually ruthlessly sacked, it is very obvious that war made it very rich. In its heyday, it was a fabulously wealthy place. I mean, we are talking serious bling here. Why would you not jump on that bandwagon? If you can make far more money fighting than farming, why wouldn't you do it? Especially if everyone else is. Who wants to get left behind? Inside a generation, Assyria went from being a nation that fought to live, to one that quite literally lived to fight. Every year the army will be mobilised. Every year there will be a campaign to pillage another foreign city. A thorough embracing of war, not as a necessity, but as a predominant component of the economy, causes several problems. First, of course, there is no end to it. Every new conquest, every expansion of the borders, just brought the Assyrians into contact with another potential foe. There is always someone else over the next hill. You beat the Babylonians, you end up facing the Scythians. Defeat the Edomites, and you come across Moab. Defeat Israel, and you come against Judah and Philistia. Behind them is Egypt. Every new victory made the borders longer, the army spread ever thinner, and the ever-expanding empire encompassing ever more subject peoples, seething with resentment. The Assyrians dealt with this in two ways. They had a policy of forcibly relocating the leaders and ruling class of conquered peoples to other parts of their empire, limiting the possibility of organised disaffection. Mostly, though, they relied on savagely punishing disobedience. Even by the harsh standards of the time, the Assyrians were renowned for their cruelty. They were not people to be crossed lightly. Even so, by the middle of the 7th century BC, they were spending a considerable proportion of their time putting down assorted uprisings, rebellions and revolts. And yet they had to keep on fighting, because their inflated economy was now completely dependent on a steady stream of new plunder. The empire reached its greatest extent in 639 BC, when it encompassed the whole of what is now Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan and Israel, the majority of what is now Egypt, and a good chunk of what is now eastern Turkey. And then, very suddenly, all the writing stops. No more great deeds are recorded, no triumphant processions are shown, no offensive operations to chastise reluctant subjects detailed. The peoples the Assyrians had ruthlessly suppressed for so long finally rose up all at the same time, overwhelming their defences. New invaders, the Cimmerians, the Scythians, and especially the Medes, surged across the borders. In less than 30 years, not much more than a generation, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had gone, and Nineveh was in ruins. The Assyrians are a good example of what happens when a culture takes a wrong turn. Greed and lust for wealth, pride and cruelty, all locked the Assyrians into an ever-expanding cycle of war and destruction, and eventually, of course, it consumed them. It's a salutary lesson on the dangers of materialism. So, what ultimately happened to the Assyrians? Well, nothing actually. They are still around. They are, after all, the indigenous people of that part of the Fertile Crescent, even if they are now a minority, and they live there to this very day. They are now Christians to a man, and as a result have been heavily persecuted in recent years by extremist Muslim groups like ISIL. Over half of them have been forced to flee the country, and there are now sizable Assyrian communities in a dozen different countries, the largest being in Sweden, Germany, the United States and Australia. Those who remain have drawn upon their ancient martial traditions and formed militias to defend their lands. They have had some success, in spite of being heavily outnumbered and outgunned. Assyria still stands.